Snorkeling trip turns horror. Snorkeller mauled by shark near Lady Elliot Island at Great Barrier Reef. A terrifying shark encounter unfolded on Thursday morning near Lady Elliot Island, located at the southern tip of the Great Barrier Reef, after a man in his 50s was attacked while snorkeling in shallow reef waters. Now let's dive deeper and explore every layer of this story on our AI podcast.
Imagine for a second that you're floating in the crystal clear, shallow waters of a marine paradise. You're right at the southern tip of the Great Barrier Reef. The water is vibrant, it's teeming with this incredibly rich marine life. The sun is warming your back and you're just taking it all in. You are completely at peace. And then, without any warning at all, the unimaginable happens.
Yeah, it really it taps into a very primal, deep-seated fear for anyone who spends time in the ocean. You know, you go from absolute tranquility to sudden urgent survival in just a fraction of a second. It's that immediate shift in reality that our brains genuinely struggle to process.
Right. And welcome to our deep dive today into a recent and honestly incredibly intense shark encounter at Lady Elliot Island. Our mission today is to unpack the reality of this incident. But we're going far beyond just, the basic headlines. We're going to examine the fascinating physiological mechanics of human survival, the massive logistical hurdles of executing trauma medicine on a remote patch of coral, and the really bizarre paradox of an ecosystem where apex predators and humans interact constantly, but almost never clash.
It's a fascinating situation to analyze, largely because of the specific environment where it unfolded. To really understand the gravity of what happened, we have to start with the location itself. I mean, this isn't just your standard stretch of coastline. Lady Elliot Island is a 45-hectare coral cay. And that geological distinction is really the key to this entire story.
Okay, let's unpack this right out of the gate, because I think a lot of people hear the word island and they just picture, a sandy beach sloping gently into the water. But for anyone who hasn't been to one, what actually is a coral cay? Because it fundamentally changes how you interact with the ocean, right?
Absolutely, it does. A coral cay is essentially a low-lying island formed entirely on top of a coral reef. It's built up over thousands of years from the skeletal remains of marine animals, corals, and sediments that ocean currents push together. So because it sits right on top of the reef system, you don't have this long, gradual wade into deep water. You step off the beach, and almost immediately you are completely immersed in a highly dense, incredibly active marine ecosystem.
Wow, so you're just instantly in the thick of it.
Yeah, exactly. There's often a sharp drop-off right into deeper pelagic waters. You are stepping straight into the wilderness.
Which is exactly why people travel there in the first place. You go to a coral cay specifically to snorkel and scuba dive, because the biodiversity is right at your literal doorstep. So keeping that specific environment in mind, let's get into what actually happened. It was a Thursday morning. A man in his 50s was out snorkeling in those shallow reef waters close to the island, just experiencing that marine density we're talking about. And that is when he was bitten. He suffered severe lacerations and puncture wounds, specifically to his arm and to his abdomen.
And if we look at those specific injury locations from a trauma perspective, the situation is instantly life-threatening. The abdomen houses critical organs and massive blood vessels like the descending aorta and the inferior vena cava. Even a shallow puncture there can lead to catastrophic internal bleeding.
Right, which is terrifying when you're in the water.
Exactly. And a severe laceration to the arm, well, depending on if it hit the brachial artery, means you could bleed out in a matter of minutes. Not to mention, your core and your arms are the primary biological tools you need to physically pull yourself through the water.
Which makes what happened next completely astounding to me. Because despite those massive injuries, despite the bleeding and the obvious terror of suddenly becoming prey, the man actually managed to swim back to shore under his own power. I can't even begin to wrap my head around how someone physically accomplishes that.
Yeah.
How does the body not just shut down from the shock and the pain?
What's really fascinating here is the sheer mechanics of the human survival instinct. In a moment of extreme trauma like that, your body initiates a massive instantaneous dump of epinephrine.
As we commonly call adrenaline, right?
Yes, exactly. Your sympathetic nervous system essentially hijacks your biology. It triggers profound vasoconstriction, meaning your blood vessels rapidly narrow to slow down bleeding and shunt whatever blood you have left straight to your vital organs and your brain.
So the body is basically applying its own internal tourniquets to keep the engine running.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. And at the same time, that adrenaline surge suppresses peripheral pain receptors. He likely didn't feel the true extent of those lacerations while he was swimming. The brain prioritizes one single goal, which is getting out of the water. Making it back to the shore was the crucial first step. If he doesn't make that swim, if he waits for someone to pull him out, the window for survival probably closes right then and there.
Because in any marine survival situation, removing yourself from the environment is the most vital action to take.
And obviously the most difficult.
Yeah.
But yes, his ability to push through the trauma and get to the sand effectively initiated the entire chain of survival.
And that brings up a really crucial piece of context about this specific situation. This man and the group he was with weren't actually staying at the Lady Elliot Island eco resort. They hadn't taken the usual guest transport. They arrived out at the reef on a private vessel.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that detail highlights the hidden vulnerability of remote marine travel. When you're out on a private boat at the southern tip of the Great Barrier Reef, it feels like the ultimate freedom. But your vulnerability is exponentially higher because you are entirely reliant on your own resources.
Yeah, because if you get a massive laceration on a private boat 50 miles from land, your standard marine first aid kit just isn't going to cut it.
Exactly. The fact that this incident happened close to the island meant that the resort's infrastructure became an absolute lifeline. If they had been anchored just a few miles further out, isolated on that private vessel without immediate access to the shore, the timeline for medical intervention would have been stretched to the breaking point. The golden hour, that critical window in trauma medicine where rapid intervention drastically increases survival rates, would have been completely lost.
It's honestly a miracle he made it to the beach. But making it to the sand is really only half the battle when you're that far from the mainland, so he gets out of the water. Thankfully, there were bystanders nearby who immediately saw what was happening and flagged down the staff at the Lady Elliot Island Eco Resort.
And that handoff is the most delicate part of remote trauma medicine. You're transitioning from raw survival instinct to lay people recognizing the severity of the emergency and then bringing in trained personnel who have to instantly pivot from running an eco resort to managing a critical trauma scene.
The resort staff provided immediate assistance. They stabilized him and started coordinating the emergency medical response. And I think we need to talk about what stabilization actually looks like in this context, because it's not just putting a bandage on a cut. We're talking about massive blood loss.
Right. Stabilization in this scenario requires aggressive hemorrhage control. They had to apply direct pressure, likely use tourniquets for the arm laceration, and pack the abdominal wounds to manage the bleeding. They also have to treat for clinical shock, keeping his core temperature up while his circulatory system is heavily compromised. But there's another hidden danger here that makes marine trauma so complex, and that's the environment itself.
You mean the ocean water getting into the wounds?
Exactly. Coral reef environments are biologically dense, which means the water is absolutely loaded with marine bacteria, things like Vibrio species, which thrive in warm, salty environments. When those bacteria enter a deep puncture wound or a jagged laceration, the risk of rapid, severe tissue infection is incredibly high.
So they aren't just fighting the immediate trauma.
Right. Stabilization isn't just about keeping the blood inside the body. It's about trying to protect the wound from further contamination in an inherently non-sterile environment until you can get him to a surgeon and on broad-spectrum antibiotics.
Which means the resort staff are fighting the loss on two fronts: blood loss and infection. And they're doing this on a tiny island. That is when Life Flight Australia enters the picture. The critical care medical team from Life Flight was deployed. They arrived at the island, assessed him on a stretcher right there at the scene, and then airlifted him by helicopter straight to Bundaberg Hospital. He's now reported to be in stable condition. But how on earth do you coordinate a specialized medical airlift from a 45-hectare piece of coral?
You can only do it because of the infrastructure that's been built into that specific island. Lady Elliot Island has its own airstrip. It's a massive logistical asset. Typically, it handles the daily tourist flights connecting the island to Bundaberg, Hervey Bay, Brisbane, and the Gold Coast. But the moment an emergency is called in, that exact same infrastructure transforms into a critical medical corridor.
So without that airstrip, what's the alternative? A boat ride.
A boat transfer for a patient with severe abdominal puncture wounds could take hours. The vibrations of the boat, the waves, the delay in getting to a surgical theater, it drastically reduces the chances of survival. Because of the airstrip, the helicopter can land directly on the quay. The critical care team gets to him within that golden hour. They can administer advanced pain management, replace fluids intravenously, and transport him smoothly through the air.
Wow.
It's a perfectly executed chain of survival. The victim swims, the bystanders alert, the staff stabilizes, and the infrastructure allows life flight to do their job. If any single link in that chain breaks, the outcome is tragically different.
It's just phenomenal that all those pieces fell into place exactly as they needed to. So the man is stable in the hospital, recovering. But back on Lady Elliot Island, the reality of what just happened has clearly set in. The resort immediately closed the specific snorkeling zone where the attack happened. Staff and marine experts are actively monitoring the water, and they've briefed all the current guests about the incident and the safety protocols. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. Despite all the monitoring and all the experts looking at this, they still don't know what kind of shark actually bit him. The suspect is completely unknown.
Which is actually very common in these incidents, especially in highly biodiverse areas. When you look at the ecology of this specific reef system, narrowing down the species is incredibly difficult because the waters are essentially a superhighway for a massive variety of predators.
Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, the resort actually lists the species you can commonly see while snorkeling there. The lineup includes epaulet sharks, gray carpet sharks, black-tip reef sharks, white-tip reef sharks, tawny nurse sharks, gray reef sharks, hammerhead sharks, and tiger sharks. That is a staggering concentration of apex predators and smaller hunting sharks sharing a very small geographical space.
It's an incredible display of marine density. And it leads us directly to the core paradox of the reef. You have this massive, thriving population of predators, everything from the smaller, bottom-dwelling epaulet sharks to the massive, highly migratory tiger sharks, and they are sharing the water with human snorkelers and divers every single day.
Right.
Logically, if you put a fragile, slow-moving land mammal into a confined space with a dozen species of predatory fish, you'd think attacks would be a daily occurrence.
Exactly. I mean, if the reef is teeming with tiger and hammerhead sharks, how is it possible that attacks are considered an extreme anomaly? What's keeping them from treating snorkelers like an all-you-can-eat buffet?
It all comes down to biological programming and something called a search image. Sharks have evolved over millions of years to hunt very specific types of prey. Fish, seals, turtles, depending on the species. That's their search image. Humans simply do not fit that profile. We are bony, we aren't calorically dense compared to a seal, and we move awkwardly in the water. We simply aren't their natural food source.
So they basically look at us and think, not food, moving on.
Yes. The vast majority of the time, they are completely indifferent to us. When incidents like this do occur, especially in shallow reef waters, it's rarely a predatory attack. It's usually a case of mistaken identity or an investigative bite. Sharks don't have hands. They investigate their environment with their mouths. If the water is slightly murky or if there's a lot of fish activity nearby, a shark might take an exploratory bite to figure out what you are. The problem is, an exploratory bite from an animal with rows of serrated teeth causes catastrophic damage to human tissue.
Which explains why the marine experts are so puzzled by this. It's an extreme anomaly that breaks the established pattern of peaceful coexistence. The ecosystem is functioning perfectly normally 99.9% of the time, but Thursday morning fell into that tiny fraction of a percent where the wires crossed.
And that's the reality of stepping into an untinned environment. No matter how comfortable we feel or how heavily marketed a marine paradise is, it remains fundamentally wild. The animals aren't malicious, but they are wild and they operate on instinct. That unpredictability demands our respect.
And that really brings us to the ultimate takeaway from unpacking this entire event. When you look at all the different facets of this story, you're really looking at a narrative of two very distinct halves. On one side, you have a stark, terrifying reminder of the wild nature of marine ecosystems. The ocean isn't a curated swimming pool. It is a complex, indifferent habitat filled with apex predators that are perfectly adapted to their environment, while we are just temporary, vulnerable visitors.
But on the other side, you have this profoundly inspiring display of human capability. You have a man who refused to give up, whose biology literally altered itself to allow him to survive massive trauma. And you have an incredibly complex network of lay people, eco-resort staff, and critical care medical teams perfectly executing a remote rescue operation. It's the intersection of our deep physical vulnerability in nature and our incredible logistical capability to save each other.
And for you listening, this is exactly why understanding a story like this matters. When you venture into beautiful wild habitats, whether it's diving at the Great Barrier Reef, backcountry skiing, or hiking a remote trail, it underscores the absolute necessity of situational awareness. It's a reminder to ask yourself, what is my emergency plan?
Exactly. It's about knowing the infrastructure of where you're visiting. Are you relying solely on a private vessel? Or are you near a staffed facility? Is there an airstrip? Do you have a way to communicate if things go wrong? Knowledge and preparation don't diminish the beauty or the thrill of visiting a protected paradise. They actually allow you to experience it more safely. Understanding the risks and the chain of survival makes you a significantly better, more responsible traveler.
Well said. It's been an intense exploration today, but the sheer willpower of the survivor and the flawless execution of the medical response is truly something to marvel at. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. With the snorkeling area at Lady Elliot Island temporarily closed and marine experts closely monitoring the waters to try and understand this anomaly, one has to wonder, how does a rare, unpredictable event like this alter the psychological relationship between the current guests on the island and the ocean surrounding them? Does a single terrifying incident permanently change how humans interact with the protected wilderness? Or does the allure of the wild, the desire to witness that incredible biodiversity firsthand, ultimately pull us right back into the water? Something to think about the next time you find yourself standing at the edge of the sea, looking out into the deep.
Okay, one question for you. What led to the shark attack on a snorkeler at Lady Elliot Island? And how did emergency teams respond to rescue the injured man from the reef waters? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.